Hello and welcome back to another week of NFL DFS. We're covering a first look Draftkings Week 14. Again, we covered the FanDuel slate yesterday, so go ahead, like and subscribe to this video. Check out the FanDuel first look. We're going to cover Draftkings today, specifically on the PPR format site. Let's go ahead and get started here. Talk about QB and the loaded top end of the position. Similar to FanDuel, I think that this is where you're going to find the majority of what you're looking for this week. There are a few plays that I'm interested in discussing that I didn't really want to talk about yesterday. But yeah, this is when you're talking about quarterback for DK, obviously you want to have a guy that has the rushing floor as well as the ability to hit the 100-yard rushing bonus as well as the 300-yard passing bonus. That guy, as of this moment, is Jalen Hurts, who obviously had an awesome week last week. Back-to-back DraftKings weeks of 30-plus points. Has the ability to throw for over 300 yards. Has the ability to throw over or to run over 100 yards on the ground. Now, he didn't have to be pressed necessarily last week to run the football. I think this week he probably will have to at least explore a few more rushing attempts. I think that the floor of rushing volume is around 8 to 10 designed runs. Tennessee, a pass funnel. They do really well against the run. The Giants have really fallen off defensively over the past month. I do think that Jalen Hurts being on the road here may be forced to scramble a little bit more than he did last week. So love the spot for Jalen this week, 8,100. He's going to be my favorite quarterback up at the top range. I do want to just touch on Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes. Both of them come into tough matchups. Kansas City being on the road in a division game. Buffalo at home in a division game. I think that this is a spot where I'd be willing to take either of them in tournaments. I know Jalen Hurts at 8,100 feels like a lot of money, but we have seen, and we'll get to the guys that are in the mid-range that will probably end up clicking their names for cash. But I do want to just mention that recently, the quarterbacks in the mid-range that you're playing for cash games have not paid off. Now it's worked out in some situations, like Geno Smith 2 weeks ago barely got there. I think he had like 18 to 20 DraftKings points. Trevor Lawrence busted in that spot last week against Detroit, where I felt like he was a really solid cash game play at a middling price tag. You're going to have that this week, too, with a few quarterbacks that we'll talk about. The Minnesota-Detroit game is the highlight of most things, and you're going to find that those quarterbacks are owned in cash games, and I have no issues with those. We'll talk about those in a second, but just wanted to point that out, that if you want that extra security, I do think that Jalen Hurts is worth it at 8,100, even though the price tag is pretty steep for the site. So we don't love paying up at 8K plus for DraftKings quarterbacks. Sometimes it's absolutely necessary on weeks where you might not have that dumpster dive option, but we do have some of those options this week. When it comes to Joe Burrow, I was in on him last week. I thought the game environment was great. This week, I'm going to be off. Dak Prescott, same thing. I like Dak quite a bit in general, but I do feel like this is a scenario where he's just not going to pass the ball enough in a spot where, the Cowboys should just be able to run rampant, run wild. And let's take, just for clarification purposes, I think Dak's a great fantasy quarterback play this week in pretty much any format. But you look at, the efficiency numbers were through the roof last week outside of the interception, and he still only gave you 17.8 DraftKings points. So at the end of the day, I think that the Cowboys should roll here, and that we'll talk about the running backs yet again, as they're going to be an integral part of this video. But I'm just saying, like, Dak Prescott, don't be I'm just not over the moon about it this week. Geno Smith against Carolina is certainly interesting. Depending on what the running game looks like, they may be forced to pass a little bit more than usual. But now let's get into the part where I think that there's a range of quarterbacks here where there's like 3 or 4 guys that are really interesting. So Kirk Cousins against the Detroit Lions is going to be people's favorite go-to clicking option here. And on FanDuel, we liked the play. I would have preferred Jalen Hurts in a spot where FanDuel, usually softer pricing, you can get there pretty easily. Kirk Cousins, while he hasn't thrown for over 300 yards since Buffalo, I do think this is a spot, he got close against New England too, so let's not count that game out. But we just need Kirk to get up to 20 DraftKings points, right? And I think that a matchup against Detroit should be scenario where he can get there, right? Obviously, cover boy Justin Jefferson. If you're watching this on YouTube, he's our thumbnail cover boy for this week. Justin Jefferson is, and so if you're not going Cousins' way, you might want to try to find yourself on Jefferson, or you might just try to bite the bullet and play both of them. Again, Detroit's been a lot better against the run, so I'm not as much in on Dalvin Cook as I am Kirk Cousins this week at 6,100. This is a nice price tag for him, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. He's obviously been disappointing a little bit, but considering the matchup this week in a streamer spot with one of the best matchups on the slate for opposing quarterbacks, then I think that Kirk finds himself in prime cash consideration. You also have Jared Goff in the same game, who I touted heavily last week as a very nice salary-saving option against the Jaguars. He threw the ball 40 times, had the 300-yard bonus. 2 touchdowns gets you to 24.6 DraftKings points now. I probably like Kirk Cousins a little bit more in this spot, but let's not count out the Lions here as the home favorite. Yes, the Lions are our favorite here in this spot. I do think it's going to be a shootout type scenario, and this Vikings team escaped that first matchup just slightly, and I just want to refresh my memory here. Okay, so Jared Goff didn't have the best game in the world against the Vikings. That was a road game. Obviously, things are different at home, and the Lions have really, kind of found their stride here. I think that they were in the Buffalo game till the very last second, and obviously, like some of the last several things, it's looked good for the Lions this year. Their record just does not reflect it, and Minnesota is the exact opposite, right? They've been on the right side of all these one-score games, and I do feel like this is another spot where both teams, both QBs, should be tested here. So I don't mind Goff. Prefer Cousins, but I think that Jared Goff is quite interesting. One more guy that I want to talk about, and then we can move on to running back, is going to be Tyler Huntley. We don't have the official news of Lamar Jackson just yet, but we found out yesterday that he has a torn PCL. And so I really feel like this is a spot where the Ravens are still in the playoff contention. They get to face Pittsburgh this week, which is a very important AFC North matchup. But I think that they'll take a cautionary approach here. And we saw Tyler Huntley be just extremely efficient. I mean, 27 for 32, completing over 80% of his passes. I know that the touchdowns weren't really there. He was playing a really tough Denver defense. I think that you got to keep an eye on TJ Watt this week. But other than that, this is a much better spot. And we know that the rushing upside's there for him. He may pass a little bit more than Lamar Jackson does, but let's remember when we saw this last season, the little stint of Huntley, he was able to connect with Mark Andrews quite a bit. He should be able to get his wide receivers involved a little bit more, and they are still missing J.K. Dobbins. So I think that Tyler Huntley has the makings to be a really nice fantasy option here. The one problem that I see is, I mean, maybe you want a little bit more on the ground, but I think that you're going to circle between Tyler Huntley and Kirk Cousins this week. So as of right now, I'm probably going to take the savings and play the guy that I think has a little bit higher of a floor. We've seen Kirk Cousins show up, and maybe Dalvin Cook gets the touchdowns. Maybe it's a handoff to Justin Jefferson, some weird stuff like that. I do think all production comes from Huntley this week. And if the game gets pressed, if the game is going into that fourth quarter, which I think it will, it's a very tough environment to play in Pittsburgh. I think that they'll give Huntley the ability to run and scramble on his own and make plays happen. So there is definitely risk for turnovers there. I think that there's while the upside's tremendous, there are still definitely turnover concerns, but I do like what Huntley brings to the table. Let's move on. If we find ourselves with more money, maybe we'll find our way up to Kirk Cousins here, but I don't mind that. I think that it's between Cousins, Goff, and Huntley for me on DraftKings, with the potential to go all the way up to get Jalen Hurts depending on the value that we have this week. Speaking of value, the running back group of players seems to be a little bit underpriced, right? It feels a little bit softer because we don't have the pass catching options of Josh Jacobs is on prime time. Austin Eckler's not on this slate. You don't have who else here? Anyway, I think Joe Mixon's still kind of banged up. Dalvin Cook's going to be a guy that people click on this week, but again, I'm not too sure. I think I'm actually buying into the Detroit rushing defense, and then Nick Chubb just let a bunch of people down, including myself, last week against Houston, and now he gets Cincinnati. And, Derrick Henry, you're probably not playing him on DraftKings this week, so really, one by one, and then, Barkley gets Philly, McCaffrey gets Tampa Bay. These are really tough matchups at the top of the player pool here. So you start to look down and you see, okay, what if Kenneth Walker actually plays this week? Is that a viable option at 6,800? I think it potentially could be. So we'll see. Pete Carroll, like I said yesterday, always going to be very, very smokescreen worthy. He's not going to give us any real answers here, but Wayne Gallman signing to the practice squad for the Seahawks is something I'm keeping a heavy eye on, because that tells me that one of these running backs is going to be out for Seattle this week. But we get to the juicy spot here where we have Tony Pollard against Houston. You have Travis Etienne against Tennessee. Samaje Perine, if Joe Mixon misses, is in another fantastic spot at 6,300. And then you have Ezekiel Elliott at 6,100. Now, we played Pollard yesterday on the FanDuel First Look because not only was he cheaper, I feel like there's a little bit more explosivity on the Pollard side of things, a little bit more involvement in the passing game. So I'd like to still stick with that, but I will say 6,100 off of $600 difference from Pollard to Zeke is extremely enticing, right? We've talked about this in the Discord, 5 straight games of 15 plus fantasy points for Zeke on FanDuel and DraftKings. He's getting there because of the touchdowns. The passing game volume hasn't really been there necessarily, but it's not like they needed it to be. So, again, I think that's going to be a similar spot, and I would actually bank on, you have to have a Cowboy in your lineups this week. It's more or less, do you want Pollard for the explosivity, or do you want Zeke, who potentially has the safer floor? Potentially. Now, Pollard has had an incredible ceiling, which is going to make things very enticing, and I think a lot of people will end up going that direction, and I don't blame them for it. So one of those guys is going to get clicked. I just want to keep going through the list here to see if we can get some more things sold, but we are going to click the Samaje Perine spot. All right. The Detroit running backs are certainly a little bit interesting. We've seen over the last couple of weeks Swift be a little bit more involved. Maybe he's getting a little bit healthier. 14 for 62 isn't necessarily the best, but the pass game work has been there for him the past 2 weeks. So after getting in the end zone last week, you really saw DeAndre Swift be a force, especially later in the game there. Jamal Williams still, finds a way to score touchdowns. He leads the league in that category still. I think those are both interesting options in a really high totaled game. Where it gets interesting here is where you go. Do you want to play a Tampa Bay running back against San Francisco? No. Do you want to play somebody against Seattle? We talked about Foreman yesterday a little bit. That's an intriguing spot. I think that you should keep an eye on the Pacheco spot, even though there's the tough matchup there. Singletary looks like he's kind of ceded some work to Cook there. Zonovan Knight, we mentioned before the start of the stream, is going to be a feature piece even if Michael Carter is active and healthy for this game, which he is practicing this week. So Zonovan Knight, probably missing the window of that if you haven't played him the last 2 weeks. It's probably not the best idea to jump back on that train. Here's where things get interesting. I think that you can roster a guy from Seattle, but are you going to want Tony Jones Jr., who's the actual, he's the most Kenneth Walker-like back in the backfield. When you look at all all of what those running backs are good at, that Tony Jones Jr. spot is the closest thing to Kenneth Walker in terms of being able to run between the tackles. DJ Dallas, like I said, dealing with a high ankle sprain. He played through it during the last part of last week's game. So he's banged up. Travis Homer is banged up as well, but you're going to want to roster somebody from Seattle in this 5K range or high fours to kind of give yourself a little bit of extra savings to potentially get up to a guy like Justin Jefferson, who we'll talk about very, very soon here. So what I'm going to do as of right now, I think the situation warrants taking the guy that's the healthiest. And so I know that Travis Homer is more of a pass-catching back than he is a between-the-tackles kind of guy. I think I'm going to end up clicking his name right now and going from there. The the last thing that I want to do, we'll move Homer to flex here in a second, but I do want to get. We used Pollard for the FanDuel first look. Let's use Zeke for the DraftKings first look. Okay, and then we'll put. Why am I blanking? Travis Homer. If you're watching this on YouTube or listening back on Twitch, this Seattle running back situation is literally going to be like a game time decision. Maybe we'll have a little bit more clarity on this on Friday, but again, first looks are first looks for a reason. Wide receiver, Justin Jefferson, 9K. I want to try to do everything I can to get here. It was tough yesterday to get him in on FanDuel. Like I said, though, this is going to be another spot where Amon-Ra St. Brown's too cheap yet again. Just keep playing him. Like you're going to have to choose between Amon-Ra St. Brown and Justin Jefferson this week. I'd be shocked if you were able to find a build where you could play both of them. So many people probably will get their exposure to Justin Jefferson via Kirk Cousins, and they'll place Amon-Ra St. Brown in the same game. I have no problems with that. So I think that you just need to play one of St. Brown or Jefferson to get that game exposure. Chris Godwin did get a price hike. I was hoping that this would be a little bit lower towards the 6K range, but 6,700 still very solid for him. It's a nice opportunity to go potentially back to the well on Christian Kirk, who had a very nice game despite his quarterback and the rest of his team sucking. The only guy to really do anything in that Jacksonville spot last week was Christian Kirk, and I think 6,600 still not high enough to where I feel uncomfortable going here. He and this Jacksonville pass receiving core is in a fantastic funnel spot. Like I said, Tennessee really, really good against the run, horrific against the pass. Mike Evans just doesn't seem to be on the same page as Tom Brady this year. You rarely see him under 7K on DraftKings, and I think I'm halfway tempted to look his way, but I think he's more of a tournament play as of right now, and I think he needs an additional body to potentially miss, but he's always a guy that could come in and score 2 touchdowns at any point. So other plays for wide receiver, you rarely see Deebo Samuel at 6,100 too. Like, this feels like a really big misprice. But the guy that I want to talk about is Garrett Wilson, who just doesn't get a price increase. He just doesn't get a price increase. He got $600 higher than last week. This guy should be a 7K wide receiver on DraftKings, if not higher. I'm playing him yet again, going up against Buffalo. It's going to be a tough matchup, obviously, but the Jets should find themselves behind in a lot of scenarios, and Garrett Wilson, a target machine, target monster. He only came through with 8 out of those 15 targets. Just imagine if he has 10, 11 receptions. Like, this is a guy that could score 35 DraftKings points. And I think that we're only looking for 12, right? At 5,900, we're looking for 12 DraftKings points. Obviously, you'd want it to be closer to 15, but it's just too good of a spot for him. So I'm going to play Garrett Wilson here to start things off at the wide receiver position. One guy I do want to touch on here as we move down the list, Jerry Jeudy is going to be active for this Kansas City game. Cortland Sutton, a little bit banged up here. I'm not playing a Denver guy in cash most likely, and not going to use them here, but I do want to say it's a pretty decent spot for them. George Pickens at 5K, squeaky wheel narrative there, like we talked about yesterday. Wants more targets. I can't play Tyler Boyd after he dropped that touchdown last week. That was absolutely brutal. If you want exposure to Minnesota and you're not sold on the Hawkinson spot, which we'll talk about soon, Adam Thielen's a guy at 4,900 that can make a lot of sense. And then the final play that I want to bring up just for right now, just for this first look specifically, is going to be Zay Jones, who comes in at 4,700. He dropped a touchdown last week. Had a goose egg for a very long time. It was very weird to see a 10-target game, then a 14-target game, and then a drop-off at 7. This does depend on Trevor Lawrence's health. So as of right now, I feel a little bit better. I don't feel like the best about this, but hopefully we do feel better about it as the week goes on. But 4,700 for a guy that dipped down in price. I do think that the targets are still going to be in the 7 to 10 range, and hopefully he's a little bit more efficient with his actual receptions. So again, like I said, Missed on a big play. He also dropped a touchdown. Bad variance week for Zay Jones. I think you can go back to the well in a spot where they're not going to be able to run the football, and they need to win this game. So I think that those are your salary saving options here. Garrett Wilson, Zay Jones. You don't necessarily have to dumpster dive, but if we find a spot where maybe you have Treylon Burks out, you got to keep an eye on what's going on with Kadarius Toney. Maybe that opens up some options for some of those guys, but I'm not going to go too far out of my way. DJ Chark is also another interesting option to where if somebody sits for the Lions, I think he's in an interesting spot in a really good game environment. But I do want to see what this gives us. It feels as of right now that Justin Jefferson is going to be out of our price range again. Yeah, that's just probably not going to end. Well, I could actually make that work. I do think that, if you're listening back to this, Justin Jefferson or Amon-Ra St. Brown should be in your area here. One of these guys is going to be massively owned, if not both of them. And I think that the field is probably going to end up trying to go to Amon-Ra St. Brown where they can. So I don't mind that spot, but for right now, I think we can use the cover boy in Justin Jefferson here, who, as an underdog, the Vikings have to keep winning. They have to keep, continuing to match what Dallas and the Eagles are bringing to the table. And so I think this is not going to be as big of a cakewalk for the Vikings as it looks. So I think that Justin Jefferson's in a fantastic spot, and the Lions should give them a run for their money. When it comes to defense, I always love to just pay down somewhere under 2,500. So I'm not going to put too much thought into this. I think that the Steelers are interesting, but I don't really want a quarterback going up against that defense. There's nothing that stands out down here, really, honestly. It's all kind of gross. I think that the Bucs are somewhat interesting here against Brock Purdy. So right now, we'll probably end up going this way. I also think that Jacksonville is somewhat interesting. So let's go with the Bucs here and call it. Oh, no. You know what? No, we're going to go with the Browns. Save a little bit more money going up against Cincinnati. I know that Burrow's been otherworldly, but there's something about the Browns going up against Cincinnati that always makes things, one, low scoring, and two, the Browns usually come out on top of that. So we'll go Browns. I have some interest in the Buccaneers too. So again, in a situation where we dive in closer to Friday, Saturday, and you guys are watching this back, I do like the Buccaneers too. I'm just trying to find a defense that makes things work for us. So 4,900 left to spend. I could potentially, this is a situation now where I would like to get Hawkinson in, but 5,100 feels a little bit too expensive for a tight end. I think that actually we may end up spending up to potentially get a Kirk Cousins. I think that in this range, George Kittle makes a ton of sense at 4,300. I also think that if David Njoku actually plays, he's in a good spot. Greg Dulcich could potentially be a guy that they use as a wide receiver a little bit more often. Who else here? Evan Ingram in that passing game makes some sense. If you want a dumpster dive to who we played yesterday with the Hayden Hurst doubtful tag, you can do that. Man, Harrison Bryant, what a troll last week. I'm not going to go back to the well on him. Let's see, though. It kind of falls off from there, as tight end always does. So maybe if you want to punt, you can potentially go that direction with Wilcox. I don't think Asiasi is going to be that guy, but I do think that it could be potentially Wilcox here. So let's just put him in for right now, and that gives us 2,200 to upgrade. So let's go ahead and do that. And I think that we could potentially get off the Seattle running back spot altogether. Maybe find something that's a little bit more enticing at 7,200. Still on Seattle, or still on Cincinnati. All right. DK Metcalf's interesting. T. Higgins is somewhat interesting. This is kind of where you break glass in case of emergency, and you either play Pollard in the same spot with Zeke, or you play an interesting Kenneth Walker spot, right? So I'm not going to build a full lineup here, but there's plenty of flex plays to where it makes a lot of sense if you want to stick with what we have built here already. I think a staple is obviously Pirine if Mixon sits. I think Huntley is, as long as he's in line to start, is one of the better cash game plays here. Maybe you don't have to dumpster dive all the way down to get Wilcox in that spot. Maybe that means more Tyler Boyd. Maybe that means more Samaje Perine. I'm not entirely sure just yet. Again, this is Wednesday. It's early in the week, but I do think that Garrett Wilson, Zay Jones, Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, those guys are really nice pieces, and Christian Kirk as well in the mid-range makes a lot of sense. So a lot of stuff going on, and the final piece, obviously, is making sure that Kenneth Walker either is okay to go or we find out who that Seattle running back is going to be. That's going to be really big for this slate. So without further ado, we're going to get out of here and end the DraftKings first look for Week 14. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Go ahead and subscribe and like to find more episodes here. Like we said, we recorded the FanDuel one yesterday on Twitch, and it should be uploaded to YouTube now, so go ahead and check that out. And see you all at the top of the leaderboards this weekend. My name's Jared Block. Good night and good skill.